In our lead story today, we travel to the far north, to the nation of Finland and its 1,340-kilometer, that's 830-mile border with Russia. Stretching across barren tundra and snowy taiga forests, the borderland between Russia and Finland is quiet and often an inhospitable place. Following Finland's accession, though, to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, it is by far the longest land border the NATO shares with its great adversary. And on Monday, July the 2nd, in a quiet little ceremony that went unnoticed across most of the world, the United States and Finland agreed to put untold numbers of American troops all up and down that long border. The deal in question is Defense Pact, and it was actually signed all the way back in December of last year in a broadly ignored little bit of geopolitics that was, at that time, one in a long list of Finnish procedural matters relating to its new status as a NATO member nation. It was ratified, though, just a bit over a week ago, with the unanimous support of the Finnish parliament, leaving the way clear for the arrangement to take effect. But while the relatively limited coverage the deal has gotten in the United States, in NATO nations, and around the world, rather fairly lead a person to assume that it's not that big of a deal. The reality, though, it simply could not be further from the truth. The terms of the deal offer just short of an open door policy from Finland to the US military, granting American troops full access to no fewer than 15 Finnish military bases all up and down the country. Because the deal does not call for the construction of a permanent American military base, that arrangement has gone a bit more under the radar. But the terms of America's attachment to those Finnish bases are unusually expensive. Under the agreement, the US will be able to position and store as much defense material as it would like at those bases and station troops there basically with no upper limit. The US can establish exclusive, American-only zones at those bases, and they can enjoy free access to those zones, the rest of the bases, and the stuff they keep there without restriction or inspection from the Finns. American military aircraft, ships, and ground vehicles will gain open access to a list of Finnish airports and seaports, and the US will be able to station troops at all 15 bases, likely building accommodations and facilities to their heart's content. The positioning of nuclear weapons is not included in the deal, and they are prohibited on Finnish territory, but American use of expansive training areas above the Arctic Circle has been written into the terms. Also highly relevant is the location of the bases America now has full access to. 5 are in the Finnish high north, near or above the Arctic Circle, where Russia has historically been harder to monitor, and where Russian infrastructure, to begin a hypothetical invasion, is more robust than what Finland has available to defend. One of the bases, in particular, is a border guard base near the village of Ivalo. That's in an area where Finland's elite Arctic forces operate freely, performing some of the highest level winter reconnaissance in the world, and where US troops can pick up highly valuable skills in high northern warfare. It also happens to be particularly close to Russia's territory on the Kola Peninsula, a heavily fortified area centering around the freezing cold city of Murmansk. That's a place where Russia has a higher concentration of nuclear reactors than can be found anywhere else on Earth, where nuclear weapons are thought to be abundant, where the Russian Northern Fleet is based, and where everything from strategic bombers to exceptionally dangerous submarines can threaten the rest of the Arctic Circle at will. Now, we should be clear here. The simple fact that Finland has signed such a deal to allow American base access is not a unique phenomenon. Sweden has signed a similar deal, so has Estonia, and so have other nations under the NATO umbrella. But for Finland to sign a deal, similar as it may be, has far greater strategic implications. With the ability to station troops near Ivalo, the US will be able to maintain a presence closer to the Russian border than they've been able to do for years. But where those troops are, peering across the Finnish border at an exceptionally important military installation, is even more important. It's getting close, and then there's getting close to something that actually matters. It's a stunning reversal in posture for Finland, a nation that just a few years ago was staunchly neutral in global affairs. While Finland was a partner nation for NATO, a status it had held since 1994, it had never crossed the gap into becoming an alliance member despite the obvious threat of Russia on its border. But a byproduct of that neutrality was that Finland, unlike the nations of NATO, has had to operate for decades under the premise that it is solely responsible for its own defense, and as a result, the version of Finland that entered NATO back in 2023 is a military powerhouse. Despite only having a total population of roughly 5.5 million people, Finland's policy of mandatory military service has granted the country a wartime infantry of 285,000 soldiers who can be armed and pushed out to the front lines in record time. Nearly a million Finns have had some level of military training and could conceivably be sent to fight if need be. Owing to their disengagement from global military affairs and the unique harsh environment, Finnish troops have long focused on developing high proficiencies in Arctic operations, something that few world nations, and even fewer NATO members, truly excel at, but where Russia thrives. So, for US troops to now be able to push onto Finnish territory en masse has the potential to be less of an act by a global hegemon to shift its forces into a vassal state, and more of a meeting of the minds where Arctic strategy is concerned. The Finnish government seems more than open to the idea that the US would operate basically without restriction on a day-to-day basis, but for the US to do that without taking advantage of the expertise of the troops they'll be sharing bases with would be nothing short of a waste. The US already has a history of training partnerships with Finland's elite Arctic troops, and maintaining a consistent base partnership is an ideal situation to scale that training upward. As for what else the United States might get up to while in the High North, the plan could be to position special forces and intelligence services in limited numbers attempting to listen in on Russian transmissions from the Kola Peninsula, or to station far more meaningful numbers of troops and shore up a NATO borderland so that the combination of American and Finnish soldiers provide an effective deterrent to Russia. With NATO member nations now openly speculating that Russia may try to bait NATO into a confrontation within the next 3 to 5 years, the High North is a perfect place to do it. Putting, say, a Russian warship and a few hundred troops onto an empty but NATO-controlled Arctic island and testing whether NATO's Article 5 provision of mutual defense is really as potent as it's made out to be. But position high numbers of experienced Arctic assets on the Russo-Finnish border, and that calculus changes real fast. For its part, Russia has vowed to respond to Finland's decision, and Vladimir Putin has personally promised problems around the border region, including a concentration of military troops. Whether that has yet materialized, that's unclear. And now pivoting from Finland, there's another piece of NATO news to cover, albeit news that's somewhat less encouraging for the alliance than the affairs in its high northeast. According to a Reuters exclusive published on the 8th of June, and drawing on unnamed military sources in the know, NATO is working on new cohesive plans to defend against an attack from Russia, but it's hit a snag. Per NATO's internal assessments, the alliance is somewhere between 30 and 50 brigades worth of troops short of what it needs in order to launch the sort of defense its strategists have in mind. Now, simply throwing out the figure 30 to 50 brigades leaves some to be desired in terms of specificity. NATO does not standardize brigade strength across all nations or types of fighting unit, and depending on the unit and nation in question, a brigade can be anything from 3,000 troops on the low end to 7,000 on the high end. Doing some quick maths, that means that on the conservative end, in NATO's best case scenario, a shortage of 35 brigades of 3,000 troops each would lead to a deficit of 105,000 troops. Again, this is the best case scenario. If we take the worst case, a shortfall of 50 brigades, each 7,000 strong, we're now talking about a total shortage of 350,000 troops. Even if we took the low estimate, 105,000 troops, they alone would immediately be larger than the fighting force of all but the largest 8 NATO standing militaries. As per the Reuters report, the insufficiencies among NATO militaries go far further than that. In one example, the report identified German air defenses as sorely lacking to the extent that Germany's current air defense arsenal, including 9 Patriot missile batteries, would need to be quadrupled in size just in order to do the job. Said the primary source interviewed by Reuters, quoting here, "Air and missile defenses, long-range weapons, logistics, as well as large land maneuver formations are among our top priorities." All of this, of course, adds on to other known NATO shortages and insufficiencies, chief among them a deficit in artillery shells that the European defense industry simply isn't capable of fixing in a timely manner under current conditions. As has been the case in Europe for decades now, the slow but consistent winnowing away of Cold War military assets has left NATO short on equipment and personnel across the board, including in fundamental areas that were thought to be outdated or unnecessary. Those assessments were predicated on the idea that Russia wasn't a substantive military threat to Europe anymore, an assumption that seemed to hold true until the alliance got a chance to observe Russian-style modern warfare in Ukraine firsthand and realized that its 21st century posture was sorely lacking. Insofar as these 35 to 50 brigades are concerned, the obvious solution is as straightforward as it is unpopular: conscription. We mentioned the Finnish military, where mandatory conscription is a simple fact of life, but those sorts of initiatives are very unpopular across much of Europe, and in countries like Germany and Britain, they're basically politically impossible. If those sorts of systems were to be put in place, the shortfall of even 350,000 troops could be solved within a couple of years. Take just NATO's 5 most populous Western European countries, Germany, France, the UK, Italy, and Spain, and only 1 out of every 932 citizens of those nations would need to be conscripted in order to give NATO all the troops it needs. With those sorts of numbers, entire communities in much of those nations could go untouched by even a single conscription in a given year, and those numbers get even easier to manage when you factor in the rest of NATO's European population. But the problem with conscription, of course, is that even though the problem might not sound so threatening when it's viewed in aggregate, it gets a hell of a lot more threatening when it's your number being called, or your child's, or your neighbor's child. There are, of course, other ways to address the issue. NATO could find ways to shift these 35 to 50 brigades from other sections of the militaries of their member nations, taking troops out of, say, a national navy and transitioning them to a land operations role. Countries could find better ways to incentivize new recruits to join the military, perhaps paying a bit more upfront, providing more expansive benefits, or setting aside more resources to see military veterans through their lives. But implementing each of those potential solutions will come with costs as well as benefits, and any funds allocated to a fix on that list inherently cannot be allocated to fixing other issues that NATO still has to deal with. So, on one hand, NATO's northern borderlands are now looking more secure than ever, but on the other, the alliance has fixed one weakness and now must turn and fix many, many others. Next up, we travel to Iran, where a nearly 2-month saga has finally come to its conclusion. After a helicopter crash in mid-May led to the shock revelation that then-president of Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, had been killed, the country has been ushered through a quick but competitive election cycle to identify Raisi's eventual replacement. Now that replacement has been chosen, and his identity, his policies, and the simple fact that Iranians were able to vote him into office at all are all very worthy of discussion. Meet Masoud Pezeshkian, who, on July 6, 2024, was announced as the Islamic Republic of Iran's president-elect. Aged 69 and born in the city of Mahabad, Pezeshkian got his start as a highly respected heart surgeon in Iran, spending 5 years as president of a medical university during the 1990s. He has served as Iran's health minister. He's represented the city of Tabriz during 5 terms as a parliamentarian, and from 2016 to 2020, he was the Iranian parliament's first deputy speaker. But what he's done in the past is far less important than what he now is: a political moderate, a reformer in a political climate dominated by the hardliners that Iranian domestic and international politics are so widely known for. The only reform candidate out of 6 candidates that were allowed to run for president. Pezeshkian breezed into a set of runoff elections that eventually defeated the runner-up, a hardliner and former nuclear negotiator named Saeed Jalili. He defeated him with nearly a 10% margin of votes. Despite a low turnout election that has been condemned by many nations, including the United States, as having been neither free nor fair, the election of a moderate over a hardliner appears to have been a genuine expression of will by the Iranians who did choose to vote. For the coming 4 years, Pezeshkian will be Iran's representative on the world stage, heading an administration that seems, at least outwardly, to promise change from the Raisi government that preceded it. Now look, before we go any further, there are a few things about Iran's political system that we have to make crystal clear for those not already familiar. In Iran, the office of the presidency is the country's highest elected position. But in the very best case scenario for Pezeshkian, he's going to be third from the top when it comes to who actually is calling the shots. At the apex of Iran's political structure is the aptly named supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who basically gets unilateral authority on any matters where he wishes to weigh in. He's the head of state, he commands the Iranian military and its internal police, morality police, and all of those sorts of things, and what the Ayatollah ultimately decides, the president is expected to enforce. The 12-member Guardian Council also has veto power over the president's authority and over the Iranian parliament, and that council is basically made up of a dozen mini Ayatollahs, so to speak. All of them are closely allied with Khamenei. Officially, though, Iran's president is the second highest ranked individual in the country. Now Pezeshkian's job to run the government day to day and to represent the national leadership both at home and abroad. It's a highly influential position, and one that does give Pezeshkian the power to try out new ideas, explore his own initiatives, and work to guide the nation into new directions. The trouble is, he does so at the pleasure of the Ayatollah, meaning that the extent to which he or anybody else could actually bring about reform, pretty limited. To borrow from an article via CBS News, quoting here, overall expectations are low, and Pezeshkian's ambitions appear modest. But in the world of Iranian politics, limited is a hell of a lot better than powerless. And while Pezeshkian isn't about to turn Iran into a liberal democracy, his election to high office does suggest that change is in order. The prior Raisi administration presided over a very difficult few years for Iran, between increased geopolitical isolation, economic woes, and worst of all, a massive and bloody protest movement after the death of a young woman named Mahsa Amini at the hands of the Iranian morality police. Pezeshkian is a consummate political survivor, known for his deference to the positions of the supreme leader, but close watchers of his stance on those protests have long been aware that his personal feelings align more with the protest movement than most of Iran's top brass. By just one example, Pezeshkian published a statement in the aftermath of Mahsa Amini's death that stated in part that it was, quote, unacceptable in the Islamic Republic to arrest a girl for her hijab and then hand over her dead body to her family. Pezeshkian would shift his public statements into a defense of the supreme leader a few days later once the anti-protest crackdowns grew more and more violent. But that's the sort of thing that is to be expected of Iranian politicians, hardliners and reformers alike. During his campaign for the presidency, Pezeshkian was willing to call out several overreaches within Iran: the regime's censorship of the internet, its treatment of women, the behavior of its clerics and high officials, and the economic malaise that has worn the nation down. Said Pezeshkian in June, quoting here, "The morality police, fines, and other types of punishment must be put aside." And from another interview, quoting again, "Is it religious to treat people harshly and forcibly impose beliefs on them? We do not have a right to dictate to the people." And in 2021, when now deceased former President Raisi was elected, Pezeshkian wasn't even allowed to be a candidate. He and other prominent reformers were kept away from the race in order to clear Raisi's path to leadership, indicating that the supreme leader and his advisors are likely aware of Pezeshkian's potency as a voice of political moderation. And when it comes to Pezeshkian's foreign policy, his stances suggest that there may be real potential to begin moving Iran into a new posture. One of Pezeshkian's main political backers is a man named Mohammad Javad Zarif, who earned international acclaim in 2015 as the country's foreign minister when he reached a nuclear deal with the West and thus lifted crippling sanctions from the Iranian economy. Zarif and his support are a throwback to times when Iran didn't take nearly as heavy a hand in fomenting attacks against Western interests across the Middle East. Now, in an Iran that has led a so-called axis of resistance from the Houthis to Hezbollah to Hamas and beyond, and in an Iran that keeps near weapons-grade uranium on hands that it can throw together an atomic bomb in short time, Pezeshkian is an interesting change. He's branded his future administration as a third term of former President Hassan Rouhani, another moderate who oversaw negotiations of Iran's nuclear deal with the West, and describes it as, quote, not anti-West nor anti-East. Broadly speaking, he appears to favor the re-establishment of open dialogue with the West. He's amenable to the idea of backing off from Iran's nuclear program. In fact, he may even be open to re-entering Iran's prior nuclear deal, although whether the West, and particularly the United States, is open to such a move will likely depend on what happens there this November. Pezeshkian's conduct isn't entirely in line with what the West would like to see from a reform candidate in Iran. In past year, he's worn his own Revolutionary Guard Corps uniform to Parliament and made his own strong criticisms of the US. In 2019, after Iran shot down an American drone, Pezeshkian commented that Iran, quote, delivered a strong punch in the mouth of the Americans and proved to them that our country will not surrender. He's fondly recalled his own role in the 1979 revolution when he was about 25 years old, and he's spoken proudly of how he forced women to dress in the hijab even before it was a political position of the new regime. But for international observers who are willing to look past talk like that or dismiss it as a case of Pezeshkian trying to navigate his own complicated political reality, there is some room for nuance. It's certainly true that Pezeshkian has endorsed things like Iran's support for the Houthi rebel organization, the country's missile program, and other regime efforts that generally operate at cross purposes with the West. At the same time, it's critical to remember that what Pezeshkian has to say and do in order to keep himself in good enough graces with the regime to run for things like the presidency isn't necessarily the same as what he can or will advocate for once he's gotten to that office. One thing that won't happen is for Pezeshkian to come out and openly challenge regime policies. He's not going to go to war with the Ayatollah, he's not going to try and overthrow the Iranian theocracy, and he's probably not even going to make potentially controversial statements without first clearing them with the regime. But what a reformer like Pezeshkian allows Iran to do, and even allows the Ayatollah himself to do, is to play with ideas and projects that depart from the hardline stances Iran's highest leaders are known for. Although many citizens within Iran chafe under the rule of the regime, many don't, and the powerful Iranians who've risen to their current stature as part of the system are loath to see it change. For the Ayatollah to publicly support ideas like reopened negotiations with the West is politically unthinkable, but having somebody like Pezeshkian around allows Iran's senior leadership to float and explore those sorts of ideas without compromising public support for the regime. As one example, the supreme leader has openly criticized Pezeshkian for advocating an approach that brings prosperity through better relations with the US and called such ideas, quote, deluded. But he has also permitted the prior Raisi government to negotiate with the US in Vienna on potentially reviving the nuclear deal and making other concessions in exchange for relief. Now, with a moderate to speak for him, it stands to reason that similar efforts could follow, even if Khamenei will, in public, treat his president like a punching bag when it serves him. Look, Iran is not a place where the status quo seems to be viable in the long term, no matter what the country's clerics and hardliners might want to believe. The size and scale of the Masha Amini protests indicate a level of bitterness toward the regime that the subsequent crackdowns almost certainly made worse, and if another popular revolt does come around in the next few years, it'll be with valuable lessons learned, tactical changes, and a real awareness of the stakes from a public who would have chosen to push back on the regime despite the danger they faced. And not only that, but political changes in the West, from an emboldened NATO to a war-ready Israel to a potential and probably very anti-Iranian second Trump presidency in America, present a risk of confrontations that Iran's current posture seems likely to hasten along. There are real political advantages for Iran to start moderating its positions on a range of subjects, but wait too long, stumble into a confrontation where the clerics and the hardliners are already whipped into a war frenzy, and from the Ayatollah and the president's perspectives alike, trying to moderate Iran's positions then will be all but impossible. If indeed the supreme leader and his advisors have read the room in Iran and realized that taking a more moderate tack will reduce tensions and increase prosperity for Iran both at home and abroad, then Pezeshkian is here for a reason. The geopolitical and strategic changes that may follow will be announced through Pezeshkian's mouth, but they may serve a far greater purpose, and certainly they aren't a matter of Pezeshkian acting alone. China's naval games. From Iran, we travel to the South China Sea, where amidst many months of back-and-forth confrontations between China and the Philippines, Beijing has unleashed a monster in waters that Manila considers to be critical. The news item in question came along on the 6th of July, when the Philippine Coast Guard announced that the largest vessel in China's considerable coast guard had dropped its anchor in the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. That's an area of the South China Sea that is internationally recognized as belonging to the Philippines, but where China makes and often attempts to enforce a territorial claim of its own. By the Philippines' own description, the new arrival is a, quote, monster ship meant to intimidate the smaller and less militarily powerful nation. The ship in question is one of two Chinese Coast Guard cutters called the Zhao Tao class. With a full displacement of 12,000 tons, it is indeed a beast of a ship, considerably bigger than the American Arleigh Burke class of destroyers, the British Daring class destroyers, or the former flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet, the Moskva. It's also 3 times the size of the vessels the US uses to do the bulk of its Coast Guard patrols, the National Security Cutters. Coming in at a length of 165 meters, that's 541 feet, the Zhao Tao class ships are capable of traveling 25 knots at an estimated range of some 15,000 nautical miles. On board, they carry several smaller watercraft for landing operations, 2 French-made Z-8 helicopters, and several large naval guns. They're a newer build, with both ships of the line laid down in the mid-2010s, and they've done similar intimidating passes around the waters of Japan, Vietnam, and Indonesia in the last couple of years. And even though it's nominally a part of the Chinese Coast Guard rather than the Navy, its sheer size and likely well-maintained onboard weapons mean that it would wipe the floor with most vessels of the Philippine Navy in a head-to-head confrontation. As a tool of intimidation, it has the potential to be very effective against a regional adversary that lacks the means to do much about it. And the intimidation factor is made all the worse by where the Zhao Tao chose to drop anchor. It's currently located just a bit away from the Sabina Shoal, a stretch of land that pops out of the water at low tide. The Sabina Shoal is well within the bounds of the Philippines' exclusive economic zone, and it's about 65 kilometers, or 14 miles, closer to the Philippines than the second Thomas Shoal, where the Philippines have stationed a small complement of troops on a crumbling vessel called the BRP Sierra Madre that was intentionally run aground there back in 1999. China's attempts to intimidate, threaten, and otherwise mess with the Sierra Madre and other nearby targets have commanded most international headlines that come from that area. At the Sabina Shoal, though, the Philippines have accused China of attempting land reclamation. That's a process by which China has dredged up silt from the seafloor, built and shaped it into island landmasses, and then attempted to make territorial claims to those landmasses. In May of this year, to counter those alleged attempts at reclamation, the Philippines sent a ship called the BRP Teresa Magbanua to go and drop anchor anchor near the Sabina Shoal and, quote, monitor the supposed illegal activities of China. Now, the ship the Philippines Coast Guard sent is a respectable little guy by any means, measuring 96.6 meters or 317 feet from bow to stern with a gross tonnage of a bit over 2,200. It's able to move at 24 knots with a helicopter on board and an auto cannon as well as a crew of 67. But it also happens to be way out on its own in waters that were already thickly populated with Chinese ships before this new sea monster arrived. On the 12th of June, for Philippines Independence Day, the crew on board raised the Philippine flag, marking the first time it's been raised over the Sabina Shoal. But they did it while surrounded by no fewer than a dozen Chinese vessels likely belonging to China's shadowy maritime militia. When the new monster ship arrived, Philippine sailors got a close look at it, and, by the way, were likely taken aback to realize that it's about 5 or so times the size of their ship. They got that close look because the monster ship dropped anchor about 800 yards away from the Philippine vessel. It's since deployed a small boat for unspecified reasons, and at the time of writing, the two ships are still out there staring at each other while a wolf pack of other Chinese vessels prowl in the waters nearby. China has made no comment on the situation and has yet to formally acknowledge their monster ship's presence. Not that they're likely to, of course. We discussed the ongoing low-grade brinksmanship around the South China Sea before, but it is worth focusing in on the specifics of what's going on here. The specifics, as always, they are complicated, but the fundamentals, they're straightforward. China lays a territorial claim to most of the South China Sea. That claim is not recognized by the rest of the world, and in fact, many other nations in the region make a claim to parts of the South China Sea that China would like to control. At stake is over $3 trillion of annual maritime trade, something that China would very much like to be able to exert leverage over as it sees fit. Control of such a shipping route would be akin to control of the Panama Canal. There are ways to go around, but if China were to impose transit costs on ships traveling through the South China Sea, those prices could get relatively high and still not be more costly than investing the time, fuel, and manpower it takes to go all the way around the expansive sea that China lays claim to. Not only that, but such a complete claim, if recognized, would allow China to exert strategic authority over the region. China could then leverage its navy to control affairs from Vietnam to the Philippines to Malaysia to its ultimate prize, Taiwan. Of the nations actively opposing China in the South China Sea, the Philippines are by far the nation that has run into the most trouble. Philippine ships are subject to constant harassment in the area from Chinese vessels. Dangerous run-ins are common and put the lives of ship crews at risk. And if brinksmanship were ever to give way to an actual armed conflict, the Philippines would be outmatched 10 times over. They're protected from large-scale provocations by the deterrent effect of the Philippines' close alliances in the region, with the United States being its primary backer. But despite the risks that China has posed to Filipino sailors and despite US offers to help with the situation, the Philippines have so far chosen to refuse those offers, said the Philippine National Security Advisor Eduardo Ano when asked about that decision on the 5th of July this year, quoting here, "This is our legitimate national interest, so we don't see any reason for them," meaning the US, to come in. Continuing on, Ano explained that the Philippines and China, quote, "agreed that there will be some easing tension, but we will assert our rights, we will not compromise our national interest, and we will continue to fight and claim what is ours." At the time of writing, China has stopped short of any provocation serious enough to ratchet the crisis upward to a higher level of severity. As long as that holds true, the Philippines' public posture is that the nation would like to continue going it alone. But even if the Philippines might be reticent in accepting help from the United States, that's no longer the only option Manila has in the region. To explain what we mean, we'll encourage those who watched it to think back on last week's installment of the Situation Room, where we talked about North Korea's allegations that the US, South Korea, and Japan were building an Asia-Pacific version of NATO. While that, in the terms North Korea expressed it, is certainly inaccurate, we explained back then that those three nations are working to form a sort of interlocking spiderweb of trade, military, and intelligence partnerships across the region. That spiderweb draws nations like Australia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines into a state of interdependence that encourages all participants to take real action to protect each other's interests as well as their own. And this week, just before that Situation episode traveled out to the world, news broke of yet another strand that had formed within that complex web of connections. On Monday, the 8th of July, the Philippines and Japan announced that they had signed a so-called Reciprocal Access Agreement, a landmark strategic security pact that allows Japan to deploy its troops onto Philippine soil and allows the Philippines to place its troops onto the Japanese archipelago. According to both nations, the agreement will simplify the process needed to support each other with troops and equipment for projects like combat training, disaster response, and more, generally making strategic and tactical cooperation easier. But fresh on the minds of the leaders of each nation was their common regional frenemy. Said Japan and the Philippines after their meeting in a joint statement, quote, "The ministers expressed serious concern over the dangerous and escalatory actions by China at Second Thomas Shoal." And while it wasn't explicitly stated, it was strongly implied that the concerns of both nations go beyond the Second Thomas Shoal itself and the broader tensions and disruptions that China's maritime policies in the South China Sea have brought about. It's yet another step by nations of the Asia-Pacific to explicitly link their national defense to each other, making direct connections despite the clear role of a shared common backer in the United States. And yet again, it is a reminder that these strengthening interconnected defense ties are made with China clearly in mind, and with its smaller, more malnourished stooge, North Korea, acting as a motivator as well. China and Japan have made a habit of facing off in the East China Sea, and the Philippines do the same with China in the South China Sea. The Philippines are rapidly working to upgrade their armed forces, and especially their navy, and Japan announced in 2023 that it's embarking on its biggest military build-up since World War II. Now the Philippines' strategically critical territory and Japan's advanced military can combine to protect interests in both parts of the Asia-Pacific. Take a look at a map, and you might even notice one final critical element. Taiwan, of course, has nothing to do with these negotiations, but would you look at that? There's Taiwan, right in the middle. Funny how some things work out, isn't it? Chaos in the Congo. And in our final story today, we travel to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we find a whole lot of bad news and a little bit of good news. After brutal fighting in the country's eastern regions, it appears that all forces involved have chosen to lay down their weapons. But how long that lasts is anybody's guess, and whether the rebels in the Congolese east, even the Congo's biggest problem anymore, remain to be seen. On Thursday, July 4th, the Congo got a bit of good news for the first time in a long time. Via an announcement made that day by the United States, the world learns that the Congolese government in the capital city Kinshasa had reached an agreement with the nation's most fearsome and most successful rebel organization, an insurgency known as M23. According to the agreement, both sides would establish and respect a 2-week humanitarian truce, a short pause in the fighting that would run through July 19th and allow desperately needed humanitarian aid to reach displaced peoples in the areas hit hardest by the violence there. As part of the truce, people who've been displaced by the crisis will be able to return voluntarily to their homes, and humanitarian personnel will be able to gain free and unfettered access to the vulnerable people caught in the crossfire. That truce reaches to the Congo's battered North Kivu province, as well as in South Kivu, where the violence has begun to spread in recent weeks. According to sources inside both provinces interviewed by Agence France Presse after the US made the announcement, all was reported quiet as a fragile and brief peace took hold. Critically, the truce was agreed on not just by Kinshasa and by M23, but by Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, the next-door nation that has been accused of propping up the M23 insurgency and sending its own troops and equipment to help. The southern African nation of Angola has agreed to assist in a monitoring role. The truce went largely unacknowledged by all sides of the conflict, but drew acclaim from the European Union, the United States, the United Nations, and the many activist organizations and NGOs at work trying to keep people alive in the Congo's east. At the time of writing, the peace does appear to be holding, at least for the most part. The last ceasefire the US was able to announce in the Congo last December was able to last about 10 days before the nation had its election, so with any luck, this time the involved parties will be able to do the same, and perhaps just a little more. But by all accounts, the truce couldn't have come soon enough. Recently, fighting has expanded in the Congo, leading to the displacement of an additional 100,000 people or more, stacking on top of the 2.8 million people who've been displaced within North Kivu. Based on a combination of new displacements and last year's figures, that brings the total number of displaced people in the DRC almost certainly to above 7 million. From a military perspective, M23 has been making progress in its offensive, and it's lain waste to more parts of the eastern Congo and gathered more weapons and rebels among its ranks. The organization and its members are no heroic freedom fighters either. Although they battle against a repressive authoritarian government in Kinshasa and a DRC military known for its atrocities, M23 have perpetrated their own brutal war crimes throughout this phase of the conflict. The group is known to engage in mass unlawful killings, mass acts of brutal sexual violence, and indiscriminate violence that frequently sees innocents caught in the crossfire. For months, they've had their sights set on the city of Goma, pre-war population estimated at about 2 million. And although they've not been able to take it, the city has been under siege since February. At present, Goma is still encircled, and with the defenders there largely unable to cause trouble anywhere else, M23 has been able to make major gains elsewhere. The rebels captured 2 strategically key towns in North Kivu in late June, opening the door to future attacks in the DRC's so-called Grand North region that were impossible with those towns under government control. In the opposite direction, M23 has begun raiding in South Kivu province, and suspected M23 mortar fire killed 2 people in recent weeks at a base newly occupied by a South African attempt at a peace mission. And in recent months, the world has been more and more aware of the difficult reality that M23 in its official form is only half the problem. M23 is a rebel organization comprised primarily of ethnic Tutsis, the same ethnicity as Rwandan President Paul Kagame and much of the Rwandan political leadership. They, by the way, are the same ethnic group that was targeted in the Rwandan genocide in 1994, partly for ethnic reasons, partly for geopolitical ones. The nation of Rwanda is widely understood to be acting in direct support of M23, as documented by experts from the United Nations. In comments about the recent ceasefire, the UN's top envoy in the Congo, Bintou Keita, explained of recent developments, quoting here, "The government of Rwanda has reinforced its support to M23, enabling it to make major territorial gains." Per Keita, and confirming what international analysts have suspected for months, M23's increased combat effectiveness and Rwanda's increasingly brazen involvement contribute to fears that the conflict could very quickly devolve into an international war. Since February, Rwanda has been increasingly willing to admit at least some involvement in the DRC. In February, Kigali admitted that Rwandan troops and missile systems were deployed to the eastern Congo, albeit in what Rwanda described as a deterrent role. According to US Deputy Ambassador Stephanie Sullivan, Rwanda has over 4,000 troops in the DRC, and those troops have committed murder against civilians that were known to be in need of protection. Per a UN report, there may even be more Rwandan troops in the Congo now than M23 fighters, and allegedly Rwandan intelligence officers have recruited refugee children as young as the age of 12, sending them to jointly run Rwandan and M23 training camps on the false promise that they were being sent somewhere to work. The increasingly obvious involvement of Rwanda creates a sticky situation for the US, Europe, Russia, China, the African Union, and others, all of whom have consistently relied on Rwanda as a critical stabilizing force in Africa. There are a whole range of issues in Rwanda, not least of which that the country's president, Paul Kagame, has ruled as an authoritarian and allegedly quite assassination-happy president in an uninterrupted role since 2000. But the nation is considered a key African partner of the US, and as recently as this year, the newly ousted Conservative government in Britain relied on Rwanda for an asylum plan to process illegal immigrants to Britain after they'd been shipped to Rwandan soil. Across the world, Western democracies are used to extending an open hand to Rwanda, still often identifying the nation synonymously with its now decades-old genocide. And the whole world relies on the nation as the 3rd largest contributor in the world in terms of manpower to UN peacekeeping missions. At present, nearly 6,000 Rwandans serve as UN peacekeepers. That ranks them only behind India and Nepal, and they offer more than double the contribution of the next most involved African nation, making them an indispensable part of peace efforts across the African continent. Against that backdrop, Rwanda's involvement as antagonists in the Congo has been a sensitive subject for the world for quite a while. Allegations of Rwandan involvement have been dismissed as baseless in recent years, helped along by the fact that the Congolese leaders making such allegations had a whole mess of problems diminishing their credibility. At this point, though, there's little evidence to suggest that Rwanda is innocent in the eastern Congo, and a whole lot of evidence to suggest that it's an agitator. Of course, that clarity doesn't make anything easier for the West. Instead, it's yet another paralyzing factor in a conflict where there is seemingly no good guy to turn to, and where a whole lot is at stake. The Congo is among the most resource-rich places in the world, especially when it comes to copper, cobalt, and other critical resources that all developed nations need to power new technologies as they shift toward renewables and away from fossil fuels. But the world has been both unable to find a partner to keep those resources safe, protected, and politically stable, and unable to find a better alternative solution than just parking paramilitaries like Russia's Wagner group on top of them and waging a near-silent shadow war in the jungle. Yet if all that isn't bad enough, this week introduced yet another factor in the confusion: Uganda. According to yet another new United Nations report on the conflict, Uganda too has provided support to M23 during the current conflict. It's the first time Uganda has been directly accused of such a thing, and it's a surprise announcement considering that Uganda took part in a ceasefire enforcement mission involving M23 in the Congo as recently as last year. But per the UN Security Council's group of experts, Uganda has not only failed to prevent M23 and Rwandan troops from staying on and passing through Ugandan territory, but it's also given direct support to both groups, including by hosting M23 for important meetings on Ugandan territory. Uganda, for its part, has denied the report and accused the UN of throwing out accusations, just as Uganda and the DRC are in a decent place in terms of their military relations. Said a prominent defense spokesman from Uganda on the report, quoting here, "The allegations are laughable, baseless, and illogical to say Uganda is working to destabilize the DRC." But laughable as they may be from Uganda's perspective, the allegations raise the fearsome prospect that a regional war, although thought to be on the horizon, may end up being significantly more one-sided than was previously thought. Although Rwandan troops do pick up valuable experience with the UN, the Rwandan military is only about 33,000 strong and has little in the way of functional tanks, attack aircrafts, artillery, that sort of thing. And the same can be said for the DRC, equipped with, shall we say, a non-zero amount of working military equipment, but presiding over an arsenal that's believed to be mostly in disrepair and a total military force that may be larger but is generally disinterested in actually doing any fighting and for the most part isn't particularly good at it either. The same cannot be said for the Ugandan military, a force that isn't exactly on par with most modern militaries but still can leverage dozens upon dozens of Russian-made T-90 and Soviet-made T-72 tanks, a range of hardy and decently maintained fighting vehicles, and a grand total of 5 Russian-made Sukhoi Su-30 aircraft made less than half a century ago. It's not much, but it's enough to blaze through the DRC, especially if Rwanda is involved. Beyond that, Uganda has a good deal of economic power to bring to bear, and both it and Rwanda have some decent amounts of political capital to throw around with the African Union, which the DRC broadly lacks. The UN tends to defer to the African Union on matters of African security, and with that little caveat, the table is set for Uganda and Rwanda to at least believe that a military adventure in the DRC is something they could get away with. Finally, we must acknowledge, as always, that the DRC's internal violence is a multi-dimensional conflict, where the violence of M23 is a big problem, but nowhere near the only problem. Potentially sensing their moment to act, other violent organizations in the Congo have launched their own devastating attacks recently. In Ituri province, just north of North Kivu and beyond those 2 strategic towns that M23 just captured, several militias have carried out attacks that massacred at least 300 civilians in total. In North Kivu, an Islamic State-linked group called the Allied Democratic Forces killed at least 90 civilians in the first few days of June alone. And the Congolese military, at just the time that one might hope they'd rally and become a responsible, dependable peacekeeping force, appears to have done the opposite. Recently, they've been accused of being increasingly passive, and their command structures have faced criticism for failures in implementing a strategic and tactical approach to the fighting. Army commanders have apparently begun using their troops in open skirmishes for authority in some areas, and in others, locals have even attacked army officers as a protest of their inaction. The Congo's president, Felix Tshisekedi, has proved largely unable to motivate his military to do any better, and his attempts at showing solidarity have largely gone unheard. With careful consideration, a host of new ideas, and a whole lot of luck, the situation in the Congo may still yet be pulled back from the brink of regional war. But if that's going to happen, then it's got to happen soon. And of all the things that we international observers would be wise to feel about such a prospect, optimism, sadly, is not among them. Thanks for watching.